Consider this your exit interview from Clown World, hereafter known by the party of the first part as The Daniel and Tal Show. In 1896, French social scientist Gustave Le Bon wrote the very first book on mass psychology called The Crowd. One of the interesting digressions in it is the effect of mass college on the population. He observed the fact that with more and more people being taken out of the trades and removed from productive labor, you had newly superfluous people. People with college degrees who felt too good to work with their hands, yet there weren't enough white-collar jobs to go around. As a result, they become unemployed or underemployed, making them susceptible to the worst kinds of socialism, Le Bon comments. In the 1930s, Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter made the same observation. Schumpeter writes, "The man who has gone through a college or university easily becomes psychically unemployable in manual occupations without necessarily acquiring employability in, say, professional work." Schumpeter said that these unproductive people usually gravitate toward jobs with no benchmarks, vague jobs, careers where you can scam and put your double talk to good use, so a lot of them become spokesmen for labor unions or racial equality movements. Schumpeter said that once these largely meet their goals, they'd start representing smaller and smaller fringe groups, anything to draw a paycheck while appearing to carry out social justice. In 1873, Herbert Spencer talked about the rise of fake philanthropy groups run by such superfluous people. First, there was the temperance movement to save us from demon rum and institute prohibition. Then there were hygiene campaigns and anti-smoking leagues, and newly enacted social workers to micromanage people's families, etc. Basically, they were using the state to carve out new jobs for themselves as bureaucrats. One of these fake philanthropy campaigns was an anti-syphilis campaign, just as rates of syphilis were falling, and science was proving that the few people who did have it had milder symptoms than were once believed in the past. But to drum up support for this new movement, the new anti-syphilis crusaders spread unwarranted fear and panic to ensure themselves jobs and money from the public treasury. It just reminded me of what's unfolding now with another so-called disease. Let's hear what he has to say. It's a little lengthy, but it's well worth the listen.
Yet another and perhaps stronger distorting influence existing in the medium through which facts reach us results from the self-seeking, pecuniary or otherwise, of those who testify. We require constantly to bear in mind that personal interests affect most of the statements on which sociological conclusions are based and on which legislation proceeds. Clearly, then, where personal interests come into play, these must be, even in men intending to be truthful, a great readiness to see facts which it is convenient to see, and such reluctance to see opposite facts as will prevent much activity in seeking for them. Hence a large discount has mostly to be made from the evidence furnished by institutions and societies in justification of the policies they pursue or advocate. And since much of the evidence respecting both past and present social phenomena comes to us through agencies calculated thus to pervert it, there is here a further impediment to clear vision of facts. That the reader may fully appreciate the difficulties which these distorting influences, when combined, put in the way of getting good materials for generalization, let him contemplate a case. All who are acquainted with such matters know that up to some 10 years since, it was habitually asserted by lecturers when addressing students and by writers in medical journals that in our day, syphilis is a far less serious evil than it was in days gone by. Until quite recently, this was a commonplace statement called in question by no one in the profession. But just as while a decrease of drunkenness has been going on, temperance fanatics have raised an increasing outcry for strenuous measures to put down drunkenness, so while venereal disease has been diminishing in frequency and severity, certain instrumentalities and agencies have created a belief that rigorous measures are required to check its progress. This incongruity would by itself be a sufficient proof of the extent to which, on the one side or the other, evidence must be vitiated. What then shall we say of the incongruity on finding that the first of these statements has recently been repeated by many of the highest medical authorities as one verified by their experience? Here are some of their testimonies. The chairman of the late Government Commission for Inquiring into the Treatment and Prevention of Syphilis, Mr. Ski, consulting surgeon to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, gave evidence before a House of Lords committee. Referring to an article expressing the views of the Association for Promoting the Extension of the Contagious Diseases Act, he said it was, quote, largely overcharged and colored too highly. The disease is by no means so common or universal, I may say, as is represented in that article. And I've had an opportunity since I had the summons to appear here today of communicating with several leading members in the profession at the College of Surgeons, and we are all of the same opinion that the evil is not so large by any means as it is represented by the association." End quote. Mr. John Simon, FRS, for 35 years a hospital surgeon, and now medical officer to the Privy Council, writes in his official capacity, quote, "I have not the least disposition to deny that venereal affections constitute a real and great evil for the community. though I suspect that very exaggerated opinions are current as to their diffusion and malignity." End quote. By the late Professor Syme, it was asserted that, quote, "It is now fully ascertained that the poison of the present day, true syphilis, does not give rise to the dreadful consequences which have been mentioned when treated without mercury. None of the serious effects that used to be so much dreaded ever appear, and even the trivial ones just noticed comparatively seldom present themselves. We must therefore conclude either that the virulence of the poison is worn out, or that the effects formerly attributed to it depended on treatment." End quote. The British and Foreign Medico-Chirurgical Review, which stands far higher than any other medical journal and is friendly to the axes applied to military and naval stations, writes thus, quote, "The majority of those who have undergone the disease thus far, including secondary manifestations, live as long as they could otherwise have expected to live, and die of diseases with which syphilis has no more to do than the man in the moon." End quote. Quote, "Surely 455 persons suffering from true syphilis in one form or another, in a poor population of 1.5 million, less than 1 in 3,000, cannot be held to be a proportion so large as to call for exceptional action on the part of any government." End quote. Mr. Holmes Coote, FRCS, surgeon and lecturer on surgery at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, says, quote, "It is a lamentable truth that the troubles which respectable, hard-working married women of the working class undergo are more trying to the health and detrimental to the looks than any of the irregularities of the harlot's career." End quote. Again, it is stated by Mr. Byrne, surgeon to the Dublin Lock Hospital, that, quote, "There is not nearly so much syphilis as there used to be." End quote. And after describing some of the serious results that were once common, he adds, quote, "You will not see such a case for years, a fact that no medical man can have failed to remark." End quote. Mr. W. Burns Thompson, FRCS, for 10 years head of the Edinburgh Dispensary, testifies as follows, quote, "I have had good opportunities of knowing the prevailing diseases, and I can only say that the representations given by the advocates of these acts are to me perfectly unintelligible. They seem to me to be gross exaggerations." End quote. Mr. Surgeon Major Watt of the Coldstream Guards, when examined by the Lords Committee, stated that he quite concurred with Mr. Ski. Answering question 700, he said, quote, "The class of syphilitic diseases which we see are of a very mild character, and in fact none of the ravages which used formerly to be committed on the appearance and aspect of the men are now to be seen. It is an undoubted fact that in this country and in France the character of the disease is much diminished in intensity." Question 708. "I understand you to say that in your opinion the venereal disease is generally, independent of the act, become more mitigated, and of a milder type?" Answer: Yes, that is the experience of all surgeons, both civil and military." End quote. Dr. Druitt, president of the Association of the Medical Officers of Health for London, affirmed at one of its meetings, quote, that speaking from 39 years' experience, he was in a position to say that cases of syphilis in London were rare among the middle and better classes, and soon got over. End quote. Even Mr. Acton, a specialist to whom more than to any other man the acts are due, admitted before the Lords Committee that the disease is milder than it was formerly. And then most important of all is the testimony of Mr. Jonathan Hutchinson, who is recognized as the highest authority on inherited syphilis, and to whose discoveries indeed the identifications of syphilitic taint are mainly due. Though thus under a natural bias rather to overestimate than underestimate the amount of inherited syphilis, Mr. Hutchinson, while editor of the British Medical Journal, wrote, quote, although there is an impression to the contrary, yet recent discoveries and more accurate investigations, so far from extending the domain of syphilis as a cause of chronic disease, have decidedly tended to limit it. Although we have admitted as positively syphilitic certain maladies of a definite kind not formally recognized, we have excluded a far larger number which were once under suspicion. We can identify now the subject of severe hereditary taint by his teeth and physiognomy. But those who believe most firmly in the value of these signs believe also that they are not displayed by 1 in 5,000 of our population. End quote. Like testimony is given by continental surgeons, among whom it was long ago said by Ambrose Paré that the disease is evidently becoming milder every day, and by Ausias Turenne that it is on the wane all over Europe. Astruc and Daudet concur in this statement, and the latest authority on syphilis, Lancereau, whose work is so highly valued that it has been translated by the Sydenham Society, asserts that, quote, in these cases, which are far from being rare, syphilis is but an abortive disease. Slight and benignant, it does not leave behind any troublesome trace of its passage. It is impossible to lay too much stress upon this point. At the present day especially, when syphilis still inspires exaggerated fears, it should be known that this disease becomes dissipated completely in a great number of cases after the cessation of the cutaneous eruptions, and perhaps sometimes even with the primary lesion. End quote. It will perhaps be remarked that these testimonies of medical men who by their generally high position or their lengthened experience, or their special experience, are so well qualified to judge are selected testimonies. Yet notwithstanding this testimony, great in quantity and much of it of the highest quality, it has been possible so to present the evidence as to produce in the public mind, and in the legislature, the impression that peremptory measures for dealing with a spreading pest are indispensable. As lately, writes a member of Parliament, quote, "We were assured on what appeared unexceptionable testimony that a terrible constitutional disease was undermining the health and vigor of the nation, and especially destroying innocent women and children." End quote. And then note the startling circumstance that while so erroneous a conception of the facts may be spread abroad, there may by the consequent alarm be produced a blindness to the facts of the most unquestionable kind, established by ever-accumulating experiences of successive generations. Until quite recently, our forms of judicial procedure embodied the principle that some overt injury must be committed before legal instrumentalities can be brought into play, and conformity to this principle was in past times gradually brought about by efforts to avoid the terrific evils that otherwise arose. As a professor of jurisprudence reminds us, quote, "The object of the whole complicated system of checks and guards provided by English law and secured by a long train of constitutional conflicts has been to prevent an innocent man being even momentarily treated as a thief, a murderer, or other criminal, on the mere alleged or real suspicion of a policeman." End quote. Yet now, in the state of groundless fright that has been got up, the concern hitherto exhibited by the legislature for the personal liberty of the meanest citizen has been needlessly and recklessly lost sight of. It is an a priori inference from human nature that irresponsible power is sure on the average of cases to be grossly abused. The histories of all nations through all times teem with proofs that irresponsible power has been grossly abused. The growth of representative governments is the growth of arrangements made to prevent the gross abuse of irresponsible power.
Note at the end how he talks about how unreasoning panic caused by a fake disease scare had given rise to irresponsible power, and how it contravened centuries of English law which said that people were innocent until proven guilty. In the 1870s, they were finding and arresting people in houses of ill repute, not because they were proven to have had syphilis, but because they might get it. In other words, they'd fallen into the habit of violating rights for crimes that hadn't even happened. You were assumed to have had syphilis, whether you actually had it or not. You were guilty until proven otherwise. And in the meantime, the state was given unprecedented and irresponsible power. Sound familiar? Straight from the New American Magazine, the essential news source for freedom-loving Americans, we bring you Beyond the Cover, where influential contributors to the magazine's print edition join host Gary Benoit to discuss articles, often offering important insights not found in the articles themselves. Head to thenewamerican.com and learn more.